Hello, and welcome to the second in our series of Why Philanthropy Matters Book Club. This is where we take a look at books that are about philanthropy, new books about philanthropy, old books about philanthropy, or books that aren't quite about philanthropy but are relevant. And this week, I guess we're doing one of those, really. I'm going to talk a little bit about this book, which is What We Owe the Future by William MacAskill. Now, this is an exciting one because MacAskill in no way needs me to be giving any more publicity to this book because it's been all over the place. The world really doesn't particularly need my opinion on this book. Luckily, that's never stopped me before, so I am going to give my opinion on it. For anybody who doesn't know, William MacAskill is a philosopher at the University of Oxford and one of the leading lights in the Effective Altruism movement, which is a movement that seeks to kind of redefine how we do philanthropy and how we try to do good in the world by getting us to focus on the idea that our sole purpose should be to do the greatest good with the amounts of money available to us, and kind of incorporates a utilitarian approach to what doing good actually means. And this book here is tied into another sort of philosophical school of thought that is quite closely linked these days with effective altruism, which is long-termism. And this book is MacAskill's take on long-termism and his argument for why we should all be thinking more in kind of long-termist ways. So what is long-termism? Because I think it's easy to say, well, that sounds, intuitively like a good thing. We should all think about the long term. That would be great. Thanks. I don't need to read the book. It's not quite as simple as that because long-termism has a particular kind of set of ideas at its core that's about more than just paying a bit more attention to the future consequences of our actions. So the basic premise of the book and the idea of long-termism is the idea that future lives matter. So as yet unborn or even kind of unconceived of human beings, their lives matter. Not only that, but they matter as much as present human lives. So we should take them into account when making decisions and kind of weighing up ethical considerations. Even more so than that, we should probably give them more weight because actually there are going to be vastly more people born in the future and into the far future than there are alive today and that have lived at all up until this point. So actually, from that point of view, we have a duty to think in long-termist ways about the actions that we take in the world today. And MacAskill's argument in this book is that we should focus more of our efforts on things that might result in there being more happy future lives. So in the book, he kind of looks at a couple of different things. So he looks first at the risks that we might make the future less good than it otherwise would have been, and what we can do to affect that. So this is an idea that he calls trajectory change. So he's kind of looking at what potential we have to affect the trajectory essentially of the future as we project it from now. We can have a bad future, a kind of middling future, or a better future. How much of what we do now should be about trying to maximize our ability to move towards that good future, and what does this actually mean? And in the chapter where he looks at this, he sort of focuses primarily on the idea of moral change. So he kind of looks at the idea of how you achieve pretty fundamental shift in our moral frameworks and our ethical values. He leans quite heavily on the history of slavery as an example, which is really interesting because I think bringing a historical perspective and one that is related to philanthropy and civil society into thinking about how we do things in the world today. It's obviously something I'm very keen on. I think his actual take on it is, if not questionable, I would want to read around more in terms of the scholarship because I think he quite kind of decisively comes down on a particular point of view about the anti-slavery movement, which is that essentially the fight for against slavery was largely a contingent one from a historical point of view. That is to say, it could have quite easily been otherwise and was highly dependent on factors that might have gone in different directions. Whereas other people think that even if the fight against slavery had not taken place in the way that it did, larger factors and economic factors might have meant that actually one way or another slavery was going to end. But let's park that for a minute. And then MacAskill's view about why it's important that we think about this at this moment in time particularly is linked to his view about the risks of artificial intelligence. So we'll come on in a minute to the risk that artificial intelligence might pose to very human existence. But MacAskill, interestingly in my mind, also argues that one of the risks of artificial intelligence is it could allow a particular system of values to become so powerful and sort of locked in society for such a long period of time that it essentially becomes impossible to break out of. So as we are developing artificial intelligence and moving potentially towards sort of human level general artificial intelligence, if that is a feasible thing, we should be very careful about thinking about the value systems that we have in the world at this time and which get built into that system. Which seems to me, a sensible point of view, although I think there are all kinds of arguments about whether the fears of that kind of artificial general intelligence are overblown. But then the other thing that MacAskill says, not just thinking about trajectory change and making sure that we have the best possible version of the future, but actually making sure that humanity has a future at all. And this is where he talks about kind of existential level risks to humanity. So some of that might be actual kind of human extinction in the form of, nuclear war or the bad version of artificial intelligence taking over, or human engineered bioweapons causing a pandemic. And there's lots of talk and speculation in here about how likely those different potential risks are. He also talks about the danger of collapse, so the idea that we don't wipe ourselves out, but civilization and society collapses, and whether we would be in a position to rebuild it. I think one of the things that jarred for me in that section was he talks there about actually the need to retain fossil fuel stores on the basis that if we have a civilizational collapse, we'll need to dig them up again in order to restart society. That's good in a sense if it means we stop using fossil fuels soon and now. But the idea that we would have to rebuild a society based on exactly those same extractive principles that probably caused the problems in the first place seems to me counterintuitive, and I think needs some challenging. And then he also highlights as another risk the one that we don't get extinct or collapse entirely. We just sort of stagnate because technological process slows down. I can see the arguments here. I didn't like this one as much because I think it betrays a sort of accelerationist mindset that technological advance is some sort of inexorable force that we need to be pursuing at all costs. And I think gives into the idea that somehow technological development and advancement is something that has to happen regardless of whether or not we're driving it, which I think is one of the problems with a lot of discussions around things like artificial intelligence today. So those are the things that kind of he outlines there. Where it gets more contentious, to my mind, is in the section where he talks about population ethics. And this is where essentially he moves on from the claim that we should try to make sure not just that we have the survival of the species, of the human species into the future, but that we should ensure that our population is as big as possible, based on the idea that it is inherently good to create happy people. And he talks quite a lot about the fact that this is a counterintuitive point of view because there's something called the sort of intuition of neutrality, which is essentially the idea that we want to make people happy, but we're agnostic about creating happy people. And MacAskill goes through lots of arguments about why that intuition is wrong. I didn't really buy any of these arguments. I feel like I need to think about it more to know exactly why not, and I will freely admit that. And the book challenged my thinking on that. But I feel inherently uncomfortable in the idea that we should be trying to maximize the human population at all costs into the future, as if that is somehow kind of inherent good. I think there's something kind of quite egotistical and anthropocentric in that. And it seems to me to go along with the kind of Elon Musk view that we have a duty to, take the light of consciousness to the stars, which I can understand the idea that there is some sort of unique value in consciousness as having a perspective on the universe, the idea that kind of the universe was cold and dead up until the point at which we presumably or any other intelligent life was there to perceive it. But I don't know. I'm more concerned at the moment about the damage we're doing to our own planet, and at this particular moment in time, the idea that any of that should take a backseat to ensuring that the human population is larger in the future, I find quite uncomfortable. And then the other bit of the book is, to my mind, probably the least convincing, not necessarily as contentious, but less convincing. And this is the bit where MacAskill tries to identify some actions that people could take. And I guess the reason I find this unconvincing is, well, some of them I think are a bit problematic because the prescriptions that he suggests, I think, are quite elitist, particularly around things where he's talking about kind of career choices. I think promoting the idea that everybody should just experiment with their career to try and understand how to maximize the greatest good they can do in the world seems to me like the sort of thing that is easy to say when you're a tenured professor at an elite university, whereas the reality of most people's lives in this country and elsewhere around the world is one of kind of economic precarity and having, other concerns. So I think it kind of, maybe it's a nice idea in theory, but it doesn't really work in practice. I think the other thing that it sort of brought home to me was a lot of the other prescriptions make perfect sense. I think they're sort of fine, like give more to charity, kind of give to effective charities, whether that's applying the principles of effective altruism or through some other means, and lots of other things. Yeah, I think, and take part in campaigning and get more involved in politics to express your voice democratically. All of that sounds fine. I guess the question is, how is that any different from what we would say was good to do if we weren't applying this kind of long-termist thinking? If the actions that we take in the present are essentially the ones that we would take anyway, because they're just sort of inherently good to take, and we don't need to justify them on the basis of some concern about potential future human lives, then what are we all arguing about? And particularly if, as I think, long-termism does open up some quite uncomfortable conclusions and sort of unintended consequences. Actually, if it doesn't add anything to our actions in the present, then are we just opening ourselves up to those consequences for no reason? I guess the other thing that I find somewhat uncomfortable is that the promotion of long-termism itself is a big part of MacAskill's prescription for what we can do. I'll just read a little bit because I think, this bit to my mind seemed somewhat problematic. He says, spreading these ideas can be an enormously powerful way of having an impact. Suppose that you convince just one other person to do as much good as you otherwise would have done in your life. Well, then you've done your life's work. Convince two other people and you've tripled your impact. And he says, of course, we can take this reasoning too far. There are limits to how big a long-termist movement could be. And ultimately, movement building isn't enough. We need to actually solve the problems I've discussed. So I think he does admit that. But the other bit that I find slightly sticks in my craw is he says, the nascency of long-termism suggests that developing and spreading ideas around should be a core part of the movement's portfolio. For many previous social movements, change took time. And then he goes on to compare long-termism to the abolition of slavery and the fight for women's equality and voting rights, which just seems to betray a certain amount of intellectual hubris to my mind. Anyway, I think, the long and the short of it is I would thoroughly recommend reading this book if you are interested in debates around effective altruism, apart from anything else, because these are ideas that are starting to shape philanthropy and also kind of wider policy making and debate pretty heavily. I think also it's a good book to challenge your own views on these. If you don't agree with what long-termism says, I think you have a duty to understand why it is that you don't understand that. And one of the things that I've taken away from it is I feel like I need to go away and educate myself a bit more about some of these debates in ethics so that I can get away from just saying, don't really like it, to having a kind of reasoned argument for why I might disagree. So anyway, that's What We Owe the Future by Will MacAskill. And I will be back next time for another book review. Bye!